God eftermiddag. Good afternoon. Already told you a bit of Danish there. God eftermiddag. Good afternoon. Special welcome to Tom Palmer, who I'll be presenting in a few seconds. This is an event that would normally take place a little later in the afternoon, but we have decided to move it to this time, and we might do that, experiment a little bit with that in the future as well. So feel free to give me some feedback after the event on when would be a good time for events like this: morning, lunch, afternoon, evening. I'd love to hear that from you. Okay. Thank you very much for coming. Today's speaker is Tom Palmer, and he's been presented on our website, but for the audience that is not present in the room and maybe haven't read the website, Tom Palmer is George M. Yeager Chair for Advancing Liberty and Executive Vice President for International Programs at the Atlas Network, and is responsible for establishing operating programs in 14 languages and managing programs for a worldwide network of think tanks. Basically, Tom helps free market think tanks around the world. Now, in Denmark, that is, being a free market think tank, it might seem a little bit rough at times, but compared to many other places of the world, we're privileged. Tom has some amazing stories to tell if you ask him about that after the event, about some of the work he's done around the world in very difficult places where you have authoritarian leaders. Also, back in the old days in the Soviet Union, he's done some really courageous work with people advancing the idea of liberty and free markets. Tom is also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and director of Cato University. We have something similar called CEPOS Academy here at CEPOS. Before joining Cato, he was H.B. Earhart Fellow at Hartford College, Oxford University, and Vice President of the Institute of Humane Studies at George Mason University. And Tom will be speaking about how to deal with the populist challenge as a libertarian. Now, Tom is traveling almost constantly around the world, I know. Currently, he's on a trip that started out, I think, it's certainly taking him into Reykjavik, Oslo, Stockholm, Copenhagen, and I'll be joining you tomorrow in Vilnius as well, where you're on the program. And from then, I think you're moving back to the US, and then in a few days, you're back out again.
Monday, Jakarta.
Monday, Jakarta. There you go. And that's Tom's life. He travels around the world, and Tom is a thinker on liberty issues and a prolific writer, and he studies what's going on around the world. And this populist trend is maybe not a global trend, but it's certainly an international trend. And Tom is an excellent person to speak and think about what's going on. But I know that Tom is also interested in hearing your thoughts on the issue. So Tom will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion on how to deal with populism seen from a classical libertarian, free market, liberal, conservative perspective. Tom, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you to CEPOS and the staff and the board and the financial sponsors, and especially the financial sponsors, because what you're doing is so important in supporting the principles of free society. If we can dim the lights a little bit more here with the technical crew, be very grateful so that we can see all the fabulous graphics. Now, Martin mentioned I'm interested in your thoughts also, because these are hard problems to know how to respond. So I can't come and say, this is how to deal with the populist challenge to limited government and the rule of law and free markets. I wish I knew. I have some thoughts about it, but I'm very much interested in your thoughts on this question. So this will be, I hope, a learning experience for me. I spoke in Stockholm before coming here, and they're interested in a somewhat different but related or parallel question, which is the threat posed by what has now been called in the United States and increasingly in Europe, the alt-right, which is an explicitly anti-liberty, illiberal, statist, protectionist movement that is now making pretty substantial inroads in politics in North America and Europe. So there I dealt more with the philosophical questions of what motivates them. Here I want to deal with populism per se, and the alt-right is only one content provider, if you will, for angry populism. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the causes of authoritarian populism. We can think about the external threat that generates a sense of being endangered. I think that we have that in much of the world. We have a 24-hour news cycle in which we hear about Islamist attacks all the time. Now, if you look at it as a statistical matter, let's take the United States, the chance of anyone being killed by a radical Islamist is vanishingly small. You have a greater chance of dying in a bathtub than of being killed by a radical Islamist. That isn't to say it's not a problem. It is a problem. But it becomes so much bigger because of the media focus and the 24-hour news cycle. And any place in the world this happens will be on American and European television for the next 24 plus hours. And I think that's generated a certain sense of being in great danger. We experience an existential danger. And I think in reality, it's been grossly magnified far beyond its actual size. The other is a threat to status, and a variety of political scientists have looked at the conditions for the emergence of authoritarian populism, and an external threat is one of them, and the second is a threat to your personal status. So this is something that I want to explore more in the future, and that is our sense of our relative social status. We classical liberals have focused as have our ancestors for 250 years, on the idea of a positive sum game. The world is not always, in fact, almost never negative or zero sum. That is to say, it's not bad for me if other people become wealthy. I try to explain to Americans you shouldn't be angry if other people become better off. It's actually good for you if they trade with you. And it's also a sign of bad personal moral character to wish other people ill fortune, as economic nationalists typically do. So we say a rising tide lifts all boats. Other people can prosper and we prosper. It's good for all of us. That's the liberal message. But it doesn't have purchase in one other area that I think deserves a lot more attention, and that is relative social status. And that is a zero-sum game. If you have a ranking, let's say we count everyone in this room, and we take the highest social status person, let's say it's Jonas. Jonas here is the highest ranking person in the room. And then everyone else is ranked all the way down to the pathetic foreigner in the room. And he's the lowest ranking person. If someone rises, if for instance that foreigner, me, were to do something meritorious and other people felt I should move up, somebody has to fall. It's in the nature of a relative ranking. In the United States and in various European countries, we have seen changes in the relative social ranking. Women have risen over the last 50 years in ranking and social status. Women who run companies, who are important figures in academia and journalism and political life and so on. So that was rising, that group. In America, African Americans have risen quite dramatically in status. And very recently, the President of the United States, which is rather the pinnacle of visibility, was a black man. So this group had risen dramatically in social status. And we could list others. Well, somebody fell. Somebody had to fall when it's a relative ranking. Who was it? You can look at the demographic numbers, but you can also look at the voting outcomes. It's white men without college degrees. And which group is probably the angriest group in American politics? And which group voted the most solidly for Donald Trump? And which group answers the question, my views are not important in politics? It's white men who don't have college degrees. And I think we may have a kind of a problem here that we have not paid attention to our nature as social primates, very concerned about our status. So we've seen rapid changes, and this may account for some of the reaction in Germany, in France, in the United States, and other countries. And then finally, we've got a symbiotic attack on liberal values and on the ideas of limited government, an ideological attack. Let's focus mainly on the United States, but it also comes out in Europe also. What is called political correctness in the US, or the social justice warriors, who have come to dominate a great deal of the space in the media, in the arts world, and in academia. And in those worlds, other people are told to shut up. You are not allowed to express a dissenting opinion, no matter how polite you may be. There are safe spaces in which, remember the angry group I mentioned, white men are not allowed to speak. They are told to shut up. They are excluded. People are shouted down, and so on. This has generated a counter-response, one identity politics leading to another, and that is white nationalist identity politics. And it turns out that's pretty ugly. And what we've seen in the US is when, let's say at a college campus, and by the way, I don't want to paint with too broad a stroke, not every place is this bad, not all colleges are dominated entirely in this way, but it is a general trend and it is visible to the population. A white student from Southern Ohio whose parents are blue-collar high school graduates might be the first person to go to college and is told, you are guilty of white privilege and all the problems in the world are your fault. Shut up. Turns out they don't like it. Who knew? Who would have predicted that they would be irritated by this? And this has driven a lot of people into a white identity politics that I think is extremely frightening and disturbing. And then, and has generated a great deal of populist sentiment, radical Islamism. These three movements are symbiotic. You might think of them as simple enemies. The right-wing nationalists, the politically correct social justice warriors, and Islamists, they all would fear each other, but in fact they're symbiotic. As one grows, it gives more energy and power to the others at the expense of the liberal or libertarian middle, the people who just want to live their own lives, get along with running their affairs, live and let live. That space is shrinking as anger and opposed groups seem to be rising. Finally, on an economic level, both the far left and the far right are now blaming international trade. And so the center-right, center-left, however we want to characterize it, consensus on the benefits of an open world order is shrinking. On the left and on the right, they're pushing on it. And lastly, I'll mention this later. I don't want to overemphasize it, but it does contribute. And that is that there is a campaign that has come to billions of euros of money poured into deliberately undermining representative government, democratic procedures, free press, open liberal societies, and it's financed by the Kremlin. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is now documented fact, that there has been information warfare waged against democratic societies, liberal democracies, since 2006, funded by the Kremlin and the Kremlin cronies. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So first of all, what is populism? I found this book quite helpful, Jan Werner Müller's book, and what he identifies is two dominant strains. On the one hand, it's a reaction against the elites. This is what we hear, and this has been a long strain in American politics, the pointy-headed liberals in Washington and then the university campuses and so on. So mobilization against the elites, but it's also inherently anti-pluralist. The key factor in populism is the identification of the real people, the authentic people. We are the people, our party or our leader. We are the people. The other people, they're not the people. It's an inherently illiberal approach. Some people have tried to talk about populism as, well, just trying to be popular. All political parties tried to be popular, obviously. This is something different. It says we are the true people. President Erdogan put it very neatly in Parliament when they still had a small opposition in Parliament, as he's turning what was a liberalizing, opening, very promising state into a malignant dictatorship. We are the people. Who are you? Right? This is a very nice statement of the populist mentality. Nigel Farage, this will be a victory for real people. So the other part of the population were not the real people. There's no compromise in such a situation. You cannot have a discussion between real people and not real people. This is a victory for real people. And setting aside what one might think of Brexit, was it a good thing or a bad thing? In my opinion, there are arguments on both sides. I personally, I'm not being a British voter, I'm very careful expressing opinions about such matters. I've found to my horror, when I very tepidly said, when solicited by an old friend, I said, I think I would vote no. I would vote to stay in. But it's a difficult thing. I see the argument on both sides. And of course, the person immediately unfriended me on Facebook. Someone I had known for over 20 years. So that really was a sign of what an angry campaign it was. But it's a difficult point. But what we had characterized as people who disagreed are not the real people. Donald Trump. I wanted to put for context the full quote. He stated the perfect statement of populism. Just blurted it out, as with so many things. Stumbled into it in a campaign speech. And it was a discussion of whether he was getting endorsements of other Republicans. If somebody doesn't want to endorse, I don't want their endorsement. The only important thing is the unification of the people, because the other people don't mean anything. So there's the people and the other people who don't mean anything. Now, combined with that, we've now had the eruption of a certain form of postmodernism. Kellyanne Conway, a noted fashion model and presidential spokesperson, when the president's spokesman had been caught blatantly lying to the media, it was a very shameful moment. His first press statement, and he was forced to lie. This is like how the mafia bloods you. When you join a criminal gang, they get you to commit a crime at the very first day. Now you're part of the team. And Sean Spicer said it was the biggest crowd in the history of the United States. Biggest inauguration ever. Well, I don't really care that much, but it just wasn't by any means. Her response when challenged and shown the aerial photos, you're saying it's a falsehood. And they're giving, Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts. So now we have facts and alternative facts. There's your narrative and my narrative. There's no objective truth anymore. We dispense with it. And the media, who might check these things and have actual conversation, are dismissed. Die Lügenpresse, I'll just translate it into a more traditional European language. This expression that was very chilling to many people, to hear this constantly, the lying media, the lying media. It's like one word now. When you talk to Trump supporters, there's one word, the lying media. And here was what he had to say more generally. The fake news media, failing New York Times, NBC News, ABC, CBS, CNN, is not my enemy. It is the enemy of the American people. And that sent a little bit of a chill down my spine also. That phrase, the enemy of the people, by itself should focus our attention. I could mention also his attacks on the judiciary, so-called judges, a federal judge who should not be allowed to rule in his case because he's a Mexican, which means not one of us, not part of the people. Judge Curiel was born in the state of Indiana. He is a federal judge appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. He's a federal judge in the United States of America. But in the eyes of this movement, he's a Mexican and not entitled to rule on matters of law. And then Attorney General Sessions, his statement, I think, encapsulated this also. He said, how is it that a judge sitting on an island in the middle of the Pacific can strike down an act of our president? Well, the island is called Hawaii. It's one of the 50 states of the Federal Union, admitted in 1959 into the United States of America, has 2 senators. He's a federal judge nominated by the president and approved by the Senate. That's the answer, Mr. Sessions. But what Mr. Sessions is saying is he's not an American. America is white people. It's us. And they are not white people. It was very, very ugly, what we call dog whistle politics. Everyone know that phrase? You blow the whistle, only dogs can hear it, and the humans cannot. Well, the dog whistle sends a message to certain constituencies, and others either don't hear it or find it's deniable. Now, this question of fake news, which has become so dominant, the fake news media, you hear this constantly from President Trump and his defenders. There is actually something fake news. It's a serious matter. It has to do with the fragmentation of the media and the inability now of people to identify brand names. If it was in a newspaper or a television show you knew, it might not be true, but there was some accountability. It would be corrected if they made a mistake, or it would be criticized. Well, this is authentic fake news. ABC News, which is not the same as ABC News. But if you go to abcnews.com.co, it looks like abcnews.com. It is not. It is a fake news site. The Denver Guardian. I think most Danish people, if you saw an article in the Denver Guardian, you think, okay, it's a newspaper from Colorado. There is no Denver Guardian. It is a vacant lot in Denver. It's a phony news site to promote stories that Hillary Clinton had lesbian affairs and, well, that sort of thing. This clickbait that stupid people click on and share and say, did you know, and so on. The Liberty Writers News, the American News, the National Report, and so on. And these two are Kremlin state propaganda. And they are typically or frequently the source of the fake news peddled in all these other sites. These are deliberately, maliciously falsified stories. The famous one that was retweeted and supported by the National Security Advisor of the United States argued that the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign organized a pedophile sex ring in a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. And the National Security Advisor was peddling and promoting this story. It turns out that the basement of the pizza parlor was not a pedophile sex ring. They don't have a basement in that pizza parlor. But a man did show up, having been angered by these stories, with a shotgun to rescue the girls in the basement of the pizza parlor. So that is a serious problem, in my opinion. There is such a thing as fake news. What's happened, though, at least in the United States, is now President Trump equates any criticism of him, or even an unflattering portrayal, as fake news, thereby muddying the waters. So you cannot distinguish these phony sites, which are authentically fake news, if you want to use that phrase. There are many others, by the way. The Miami Tribune was another popular one. There is no Miami Tribune. It's the Miami Herald, which you know if you live in Miami. But the Miami Tribune was promoting all these utterly fallacious nonsense stories. But instead, they are now equated with the news. And I like to share with Americans when I discuss this Thomas Jefferson's statement, the basis of our governments being the opinion of the people. The very first object should be to keep that right. Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. and I think Jefferson had it right. Populists disagree, and our president in the United States vociferously. He threatens people in the media. He threatens them personally. And I'll give you one example. Jeff Bezos, who's the genius behind Amazon.com and many other ventures, is the owner of the Washington Post. The Washington Post sometimes has articles unflattering to our president. He threatened Mr. Bezos with tax and antitrust investigations. I do not think this would be acceptable in Danish politics. And I don't consider it acceptable in the United States, but it is now becoming the norm. So that the president issued a personal threat to Jeff Bezos that the tax authorities and the antitrust authorities would come and investigate him because a newspaper he owns had run some things unflattering about our president. And as I mentioned then, the Kremlin, a very active information war against free societies. This was started in about 2006. Alexander Dugin, who's a very odd neo-fascist philosopher in Russia, who had the patronage of the Ministry of Defense, published a book on geopolitics calling for information war against the West and the weaponization of information. And they have done that very, very effectively. And now we see all over the world, but also Sputnik News, which is even more effective because it appeals to a much more populistic mentality. It's even trashier than RT. And Sputnik now has radio stations in the United States as well, which, if you don't know, you tune into it, you don't realize it's just Kremlin propaganda. It just sounds like a trashy radio station, but constantly feeding their line in. And this is the basic message 24 hours a day.
Tom, isn't it so that when you watch RT either on the website or the news channel, that it's 90% of it is real news?
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
It's old school CNN style of thing, BBC, and then they throw in 5 or 10% of
Yes.
complete lies.
It might be a higher percentage, but somewhere in that neighborhood, exactly right. And so people can go to it, and most of it is reporting on what's happening in the world, but always with an interesting slant, which is to say, free, open, democratic societies are all crap, but never anything negative about Russia. But they're smart. It's a really postmodern type of propaganda. They do not say Russia is fabulous and the best. This is how the Soviet Union operated, and it didn't work. What they do is they say nothing is better than anything else. You may think you have a free press in your country. It's all run by big businesses and oligarchs. You may think you have the rule of law. Look at this violation of the rule of law by a policeman or a government agency or what have you. And those are real problems. But RT pushes them to the forefront in order to make everyone believe there's no more freedom in Denmark than there is in Russia. And that's the message that they promote. A very good book, which I highly recommend, by Peter Pomerantsev, on the Russian media scene. The title alone is worth the price of the book. Nothing is true and everything is possible. Peter spent decades working in Russian media. He's a Russian-speaking person who was raised in Britain, went back when the Soviet Union collapsed, got into media. He had been working for BBC. They said, teach us how to make media, and he said what he saw was a transformation. It is now 24 hours a day, Kremlin-dominated. And as he pointed out, they are able to switch messages at will, climbing inside everything. European right-wing nationalists seduced with an anti-EU message. The far left co-opted with tales of fighting U.S. hegemony. U.S. religious conservatives are convinced by the Kremlin's fight against homosexuality. And on and on. And if you watch Russian TV, it seems like there's 40 different channels, but they all have the same message, 24 hours a day. Really quite astonishing example of contemporary postmodern propaganda. The independent media are tools of the enemy. Steve Bannon a particularly robust nationalist. He's been in the news lately. He made the mistake of criticizing the boss. Not wise. And he did so in very robust terms about the boss's son. And the term was, he said he was treasonous for having had the meeting that he organized in the Trump Tower. The corporatist, globalist media. Debate is now no longer necessary and is being denigrated. Why have any debate? Viktor Orban put that very neatly as he said in the Hungarian parliament, why there would be no debate. No policy-specific debates are needed now. The alternatives in front of us are obvious. And he gave the example, if you come across a log in the middle of the road, there are some people who say, oh, let's talk about how to fix the problem, but what you need are 30 strong lads to move the log out of the way. And that's what Hungary needs now. No more debate. I'm reminded of Boris Grishkov's comment in the Russian Duma when the budget question came up, and he said, Parliament is not the place for discussion, which has now become a dominant attack on parliamentary institutions. And individual identity, no. We want to construct the true people. And Orban said it so clearly in a speech that he gave in Romania, which is quite interesting, not in Hungary. We are breaking with the dogmas and ideologies that have been adopted by the West and keeping ourselves independent from them to construct a new state built on illiberal and national foundations within the European Union. Let me translate the last 4 words. Within the European Union means at the expense of Danish taxpayers. This is because Hungary is a huge recipient of EU funds. Those he wants to keep coming. But he says, I don't want any of your talk of the rule of law and limited government anymore. But the money is quite welcome. So this is happening now across Europe. Populist parties of various sorts in power or challenging power. So the victory in England, the Alternative für Deutschland is poised. We'll see how the current discussions are going, but they seem to be on the rise. Marine Le Pen and the Kaczynski government now, which has cemented power in Poland. As Kaczynski had said 3 years ago, soon we will have Budapest and Warsaw, by which he meant the Orban model. And once it's cemented, it will be here forever. So they have a short amount of time to defeat this authoritarianism in Poland. We shall see. And then, even more authoritarian parties. I don't want to claim that this represents Alternative für Deutschland, for example, although on the very fringes it clearly does. But they're even uglier movements. So Magyar Garda, this gentleman, if you want to call him that, out on a hiking expedition with his party leaders, is a fraction leader of the Slovak parliament now. And in the Slovak parliament, and this from the Golden Dawn, who have representation in the European Parliament and in the Greek Parliament, is a traditional Greek symbol, and any resemblance to any other one used in European history is accidental. It's just purely accidental. Some may see a swastika in it, but clearly that's not what they intended. Trade is denigrated and misunderstood, and Trump again has been a forthright leader, but also Marine Le Pen and others in Europe saying the same thing. They have this view that if I buy from you, you gained and I lost. Fundamental misunderstanding of trade. We have rebuilt China. They have drained so much money out of our country that they've rebuilt China. Just think through how dumb this is. We got something in exchange for the money. Without us, you wouldn't see the airports and the roadways and the bridges. Well, fine. Without them, you wouldn't see my Mac computer. I mean, the George Washington Bridge is that's like a trinket compared to the bridges they're building in China. We don't build anymore. And we had our day. This is typical articulateness. We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. When you trade with people, they're raping you. I don't think he has quite a conception of what rape is. Well, maybe he does, but what rape is all about. But he thinks trade is a form of rape. So these trade policies based on alternative truths, emotion, this is one I like to mention because we've seen this, the news cycle passed it by. President Trump rejected Trans-Pacific Partnership. He said repeatedly the Chinese are doing this to trick us. It's a Chinese trick to cheat the United States. But only a few people pointed out the problem with it. China was not part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If anything, it was a coalition to counter and balance China. But ask people in the United States, what was TPP about? And anyone who, oh yeah, it was a Chinese thing to rape us some more, to rip us off. But we moved on. Nobody noticed that. It's now part of the official language. There's no need to have a conversation about that. And let me go into just this is something I think, it's a footnote, but it's an important one. This man is the Secretary of Commerce of the United States of America. In a letter to the Wall Street Journal, which had been critical of Trump's trade ignorance, your editorial suggests that Donald Trump is wrong to be worried about imports because such increases are associated with a strong economy, which, by the way, is true. It's Econ 101 that GDP equals the sum of domestic economic activity plus net exports, that is, exports minus imports. Therefore, when we run massive and chronic trade deficits, it weakens our economy. He thinks imports are subtracted from gross domestic product. This is the man currently negotiating trade relations with other countries. This relationship is often reported on your news pages along with the negative stock market reactions typically associated with such reports of widening trade deficits. Well, it's just worth going through a little bit of international trade accounting. He's focused on this minus M. So this is the definition of national income. National income is either consumed by households or invested by businesses or by government as public expenditure or exported, but then minus imports. He looks at this and says, oh gosh, this is a subtraction from Y. Well, the reason why you subtract it is pretty simple. Because imports are already counted in consumption, investment, and government. So if you didn't subtract it, you'd be double counting it. I'm not angry that just a normal person wouldn't know that. But when this is the foundation of trade policy, and no one will call them on it, except for the Wall Street Journal, which is now fake news, by the way, the fake news Wall Street Journal. We are just living in a different world. It's an astonishing degradation of discourse. And let me mention, because I love trade so much, trade is not a trick. And I like to give an example I will share with you because it was shared with me years ago and I found it's the best way to explain trade. Imagine you had a factory that the leading scientists had developed with nanotechnology. And in one side, you could put things you produce at low cost, and out the other end would come stuff that was produced at high cost. So Australians would put in sheep, and out would come aircraft, and we could think of a variety of other people who would put in the things that they produce. Hondurans put in bananas, and so on. And the inventor would be considered a benefactor of mankind. The things that are abundant for you, you can put them in, and the things that are not abundant and costly come out. The scientist is going to be praised until someone sneaks in, one of the fake news journalists, and discovers it was a submarine factory, or submarine port, pardon me. So goods were coming in, being loaded on submarines, and then exported, and submarines came in with imports, and they were unloaded. That's what it is. Trade is a factory for taking stuff you produce at low cost and transforming it into things you produce at high cost. But in this new populist mentality, It is a trick. It's something harmful to us. Trade is something that subtracts from our independence and wealth. Let me run past that. Now, what do we do about the rising populism? And I'll just give some thoughts because I don't have a real answer, and I'm interested in your thoughts. First is faster economic growth. And we know that it's been quite anemic in most of the countries of Europe. In the United States, people are saying how fabulous it is. It's gotten up to 2.5% annualized growth. That's not really that much. And I think that if we were to do things to increase economic growth, by which I do not mean pump priming, but getting rid of the tangled underbrush of so-called regulations that make it difficult and costly to do business, we would be likely to address this matter more effectively. And just to give you a sense of how important economic growth is, changing the rate of growth, the impact that that change has on prosperity, this is how long it takes to double wealth. 69 years if you have 1% economic growth, 46 years at 1.5. So most people think it's not a big deal to go from 1 to 1.5. It is. The doubling time in your wealth is dramatically reduced. When you get down to up to 10%, it's only 7 years. So these changes that many people consider trivial in the rate of economic growth are hugely important because of the compounding. And a variety of societies, we're in this range, right around here. And I think we should be thinking about, why are we not up to this level? What is it that is holding us back from more rapid rates of economic growth? Moreover, there's a widespread perception, and this is both on the left and the right, that the system is unfair. There's cronyism. Capitalism is cronyistic, and therefore we should have policies that will lead to more cronyism. That's the problem. That's one of the things that we need to explain. Cronyism from kronios means the old buddies, the long-term friends of the politicians. And in addition, I mentioned the denigration of debate. Criticisms are fake news. The media is the enemy of the people. Parliament is where we should not be debating. We should be simply winning. And by the way, in the United States, this has happened now in the Congress, and I'm rather ashamed of it. Even legislation that I thought was on net positive passed with only one party's support. And that is not a good sign for the United States. So the most recent tax bill, which I think on balance was a good thing, it had some things that were objectionable, including unsurprisingly favorable treatment for New York and New Jersey real estate developers. I don't know how that got into the tax bill. It's a mistake of some sort. But a lot of it was very positive. But it passed through without a single Democratic vote, not one. And that is not good for the long term, that there was not a conversation across the aisles, because lots of Democrats understood that these were good things, but they would not vote for them under this presidential leadership, in as much as they had been so demonized. What we need is the idea of a loyal opposition, and this is one of the keys to limited government and democratic governance. A loyal opposition requires limited government. This is one of the problems in Russia right now. Mr. Putin put his opponents in prison, or they had terrible accidents of various sorts. He knows he can never leave power because that'll happen to him. The only way you can have a democratic governance is through limited government and no reprisals for the losers. People need to be able to say, we lost the election, here you are, you take over now, we will be the loyal opposition. But when they fear that there will be reprisals, they will make sure that they do not lose the election. This is a very important part of a democratic governance, is respect for the other side and not threatening them with punishment. And indeed, limited government is the very heart of liberal democracy. It's not the case that you have a commitment to liberal government, and then, oh yes, we're in favor of limited government too. You cannot have the former without the second. When people fear the state when they are not in power, they will not give up power. It's just a perfectly natural response. So democracy isn't just about voting. It requires the loyal opposition, and the loyal opposition requires a climate of respect, not demonization and not threats of reprisals, not confiscations and arrests and so on. And I'll mention again in American politics how chilling it was to watch a debate in which the candidate who later won said, "When I'm elected, you'll be in jail." I am no fan of Mrs. Clinton, trust me. I consider her corrupt and horrible. But I said, this is simply unacceptable. I've never heard such a thing, that he threatened her with prison once he was in office, and then magnanimously afterwards said, "I don't think I'll put her in prison now." Which is, again, just, it compounded the horror of it, because it was now an act of magisterial power. Again, this scene, I've never seen this in American politics outside of a Socialist Workers' Party demonstration. It's really shocking. This is the inaugural address, written by two alt-right thinkers, Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller. At the bedrock of our politics will be a total allegiance to the United States of America. This is really quite disturbing. A total allegiance. This is a shocking phrase. Through our loyalty to our country, we will rediscover our loyalty to each other. When America is united, America is totally unstoppable. And then the wonderful, delightful ending. We will no longer accept politicians who are all talk and no action, constantly complaining but never doing anything about it. The time for empty talk is over. Now arrives the hour of action. And I just felt, my God, it's 1933 all over again. And indeed, the author of this promised us before the election, he said, it will be as exciting as the 1930s. And I thought, wow, I just have a very different perception of the 1930s from Steve Bannon. As exciting as the 1930s. Well, let me conclude with two thoughts. One is one of my great heroes. In 1944, Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. He warned us of this. It is the general demand for quick and determined central government action that is the dominating element in this situation. Dissatisfaction with the slow and cumbersome course of democratic processes which make action for action's sake the goal. It is then the man of the party who seems strong and resolute enough to get things done who exercises the greatest appeal. That seems to be a description of what we're seeing in the United States and other countries as well. And the last thought, a great book, which I admire enormously, Robert Musil, Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften. Musil was a great classical liberal. He was opposed to both the brown and the red tyrannies, which meant he was dismissed by many intellectuals because he saw the communists and the Nazis as essentially the same party with different colored uniforms. And although he died before the war ended and had seen his books, he had been a bestseller, burned publicly in Germany and had to flee from the country, he was aware of what was happening. And he has a description from before the First World War I want to share with you. And it's about Leo Fischl. Leo Fischl was a bank manager for Lloyd's Bank in Vienna. He's a fictional character in this book. It says, the faith in the immutable guidelines of reason and progress had for a long time enabled him to dismiss these various carpings with a shrug or a cutting retort. But since misfortune had decreed that in the course of his marriage the mood of the times would shift away from the old principles of liberalism that had favored Leo Fischl, the great guiding ideals of tolerance, the dignity of man and free trade, and reason and progress in the Western world would be displaced by racial theories and street slogans, he could not remain untouched by it either. and it describes how he tries to deal with this problem. It says, Director Fischel of the Lloyd Bank enjoyed philosophizing, but only for 10 minutes a day. He enjoyed thinking that human life had a solid rational basis, that it paid off intellectually. Then it goes on how he was trying to understand what was happening. And finally, he was completely bewildered at the modern world. In time, this becomes one of the most horrible torments that a man who has only 10 minutes a day to spare for philosophy can experience. And one of the things that I think Musil was suggesting to us was we really need to think more clearly about what's happening, try to comprehend it, and not merely shrug it off. It's passed over by after this in the book is a description of his daughter Gerda. Leo Fischel is Jewish, and his daughter is in a circle of what were called Christian nationalists at the time, forerunners of the National Socialists. Leo Fischel called them anti-Semitic louts and would have forbidden them the house, but Gerda said, "You don't understand, Papa. They only mean it symbolically." And that, of course, is a terrible foreshadowing of what is to come, because people did not take them seriously at the time. Well, with that, I hope there's an opportunity to share your thoughts with me, because I have more than 10 minutes a day for philosophy, but nonetheless not enough. And so I want you to think with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much, Tom. We'll take questions. And somebody's already... I was going to ask you the first question,
Okay.
but I might chip in later. There you go.
Yes. Thank you for your speech. Now we're here in Europe. Yeah, my name is Ole Gerström. You landed in Europe, and now when speaking about populism and dictatorships, etc., you did not, except with Brexit, mention the dictatorship we have in Brussels, the EU Commission, which is not democratic, but which rules Europe. And when they have established a policy, it's impossible to change it. The court, they have a so-called court, which has nothing to do with an ordinary court. You cannot appeal the sentences. And it defines new law taken out of the thin air. And now, you know, they are the cause of Europe is becoming more and more desperate because of migrations coming down from Africa and from Asia. You know, Merkel took in 1 million unregistered foreigners, and right now the rate is 200,000 a year coming across the Mediterranean, where the European Union has a duty, according to the Schengen Treaty, to guard the outer borders. And they declared at their last summit that we'll have a look at this at our next summit in June 2018. They are not doing their job. They're destroying democracy. They are a dictatorship. You should have talked more about that.
Okay, thank you.
What's your comment, Tom?
Sorry?
Sorry,
Okay,
Tom.
yeah, no, those are important points. I appreciate that very much. The response, I think, to over-centralization of power and unaccountability in Brussels, that's a real problem, and I certainly think that's important. But when someone like Marine Le Pen is the one standing against it, she's not saying we want to have the Europe that was envisioned of a free trading zone and a free market. She says we will withdraw, we will renationalize, we will not allow international trade. It's a dramatically different perspective. So a thoughtful liberal Euroscepticism, I think, is absolutely called for. No question about that on that score. But the response of Orban and Kaczynski and Le Pen and AfD, at least their uglier wing, is not a Europe that is based on free markets and free trade, but a Europe that is now in protectionist silos. And that is the concern that I have. But your point is very, very well put, and it's given fuel to those movements, partly because others have not spoken up in the principled way that they should have. So there was a great mistake made in the past, but I don't think it's too late to recover from it. The second point about the immigration, is also very important. And here Europe differs from the United States. There is no immigrant problem in the United States, just period. It's an outrageous lie that Trump repeats constantly. And he even talks about a new category, which again, for people who know some history, it should be chilling. Immigrant crime. People know German history. Remember, there were registers put out of Jewish crimes, that there was a special category of crimes committed by Jews. And to hear this now, we'll have Hispanic crimes at a national register, just was too horrible to contemplate. The United States is greatly enriched by its immigrants. In the aggregate, there's no question, including Hispanic immigrants, and also including those who have come in illegally, and the so-called dreamers, if you followed this discussion. The idea of deporting someone who's 29, who came in at the age of 3, has never lived in Mexico or Honduras, now being threatened with deportation, I think is wrong. That said, the Obama approach was also wrong. Giving these extensions by the president regularly, I think it was illegal and not the right way to do it. There should have been a legal process to legalize them as permanent residents, green card holders, and eventually citizens. But this approach is wrong. Europe is different, and I understand that. This is a case in which I think, perhaps uncharacteristic for a German government, they didn't have a plan for this. It was just blurted out, and without having had what one would have expected, a more orderly set of procedures to deal with a real humanitarian crisis that should pull on our consciences. But to just blurt out that they can come in without even consultation of all the countries in between. If you look at a map, Germany's here and Syria's here, and there are all these other borders in between. It should have occurred to them to have had some kind of orderly process, and they did not, and that has generated lots of problems in Europe. That was a case of government not doing the job of having a proper approach and plan. I'm not anti-immigrant by any means, and there are many people where I think European countries should be saluted for letting in people fleeing a horror, but it should have been done in a more effective and efficacious manner than it was.
Well, hang on, Tom. Just to push back a little bit, the thing you started out with about relative social status not being a plus-sum game. Couldn't you argue that the question of immigration is related to that issue? That these white, non-college workers see a threat that is not only economic. I mean, even if there is no economic, I agree with you, there probably isn't an economic threat to them. But you could argue there's a social, there is a power issue. There's an issue of, the identity of the U.S. if you have a lot of immigration over the long run. Could you address that?
Well, U.S. immigration is not at anything approaching an all-time high. If you go back to the 1890s to 1920s, it was much, much higher. The percentage of the United States population who were foreign-born or children of foreign-born people was substantially higher than it is today. Now, at that time, there were also nativist reactions, but it was mainly against the Italians. People don't seem very angry about Italian Americans now, but there was a time when there was quite ugly backlash, and prior to that against the Irish and against Catholics and so on. So these nativist reactions are cyclical. But we're not at a point of historic highs in this regard. So I'm a little puzzled by that. I don't think it's just a mechanical reaction to immigration flows. I don't find that plausible. The other element is I don't think that immigration accounts for very much of this. It's a social status that is changing. And there, immigrants are contributing very little. There's a book that I read that I recommend for people who want to read the book and have difficulty sleeping, by Charles Murray. It's called Coming Apart. It's a sociological look, heavily data-driven, at what's happening in American society. And maybe some version needs to be done for Danish and German and so on societies to see if something similar is happening. He looks at what he calls white America, sociologically, and the reason is, he then says, something similar to what's happening in other demographic groups. The society is coming apart. There's a real, authentic social stratification, and I think he documents it very effectively, that people who go to college meet other people who go to college and have children who go to college. And this assortative mating is generating two different populations that don't interact. And among the white population who do not go to college, the levels of socially dysfunctional relationships are the same as had been associated with underclass African Americans in the past. So births out of wedlock, long-term dependency on unemployment compensation, lack of labor mobility, and so on. And it is a very disturbing book. One of the things that we're seeing in America also, Tyler Cowen documented this in his book, The Complacent Society, is America is the least mobile it's been in all of its history. Americans are constantly moving in search of better jobs and opportunities, and now they're not. They stay put. So it used to be that when an industry, the mills in New England were not flourishing, people went to the Midwest, and they went to industrial jobs in Michigan, and they went to west to California, and so on. And now, when the industry shrivels up or downsizes, they just stay there. And they go on unemployment compensation. Or, the other disturbing feature is permanent long-term disability. So, not elderly people, it's an aging society. Everyone is aging, not me, but well, the rest of the people are getting older. You might think, oh, well, it's because of that. No, we're looking at people between 25 and 40. So peak earning years. And we've seen this trend line like this of going on permanent disability in a society that's wealthier and healthier and jobs are less dangerous. So there's something very disturbing happening, but I don't think immigration contributes to that at all.
Okay, interesting. Well, a few more questions here, please.
My name is Lisa Poulsen, and you asked, how come you have those populist movements? And I want to tell you, that for the first time ever, I joined a political party that a lot of people would consider populist, fascist, racist. Not that I believe it's true, but my reason for joining that party was I thought authority was collapsing. You have politicians who sort of dismantle democracy. 80% of our laws are actually coming from the EU. You saw unchained or migrants moving all the way up through Europe. They violated a lot of different agreements between the European countries. You see government basically dismantling civil rights. If you before, if you had a problem, if you had to, interact with the government, you would be protected by laws. But the laws are rapidly changing, so government can basically do whatever it wants. Your chance to complain are being reduced. I'm a dentist, and right now this country is experiencing dissatisfaction among doctors and dentists, basically because the rules we're working under are becoming more and more unreasonable. People are pulled into the courts if they make mistakes during their working hours. And government is basically pushing this movement. And I think people are feeling more and more helpless. And if you look at our government, you're saying the populist movements are actually threatening the rule of law. I basically see our government reducing rule of law because they're violating laws every day. And when they're being confronted, they're basically just ignoring the confrontation and talking about fake media, fake news. I think fake news are on both sides of this problem. And I think if you want to halt the growth of populist movements, you basically have to confront the governments of Europe who have forgotten the democratic, covenants with its people.
Well, I think those are fair points. I don't know the details of the party and the policies you're discussing, But it can be the case that both are a threat to the rule of law. It doesn't have to be one or the other. So the currently existing government, we see this in the United States also, or know a little bit more seriously. Increasing criminalization of everything on the federal level. We used to have one federal crime, and now there are thousands of them. And unaccountable bureaucracy, and so on. So this is a very serious problem, and it demands a liberal democratic response to restore principles of rule of law. My fear, and it could be people who are frustrated by this, also are driven to vote for Trump or Clinton. And by the way, I found this a very distasteful choice on both sides. I didn't vote for either one, but I voted in a place that went 94% for Clinton, so my vote was not going to matter anyway. I voted for the governor of New Mexico, who I thought had better ideas. But that by voting for this, what they're getting is actually a more authoritarian character and power, and that story generally does not end well. I'm worried about protest votes, where people say, let's do it. Let's vote for the angry party, and then the angry party gets power, and that can be terrible. It can be really terrible. And one of the elements of this is I think that angry politics are in general not compatible with free societies. And here's a difficult point that I've been struggling with. There's nothing logically incompatible with being a liberal and being angry. I get angry. I see bad things done and injustices, and they make me angry. But I try not to be an angry person, because angry people are unhappy and they become hateful, and hateful people cannot support a free society because they hate the other group and cannot live with them. So that's one of the fears I have with angry parties. They may not be hateful, but anger leads to hatred, and hatred means we can't live with that other group because they're evil. And I think we need to pull back and try to recreate a politics of discussion and debate that two people may disagree robustly, but they don't have to hate each other. And I'm worried that's the direction we've been trending.
Tom, to put this in perspective, I think it was Tyler Cowen, you mentioned him earlier. I agree, his book, The Complacent Class, is great. Yeah, very interesting book. I think it was Tyler Cowen in a discussion with Larry Summers, where they talk about Hayek and Hayek's idea that in a centrally planned economy, the worst always end up on top, as you know, the powerful people, the decision makers. And Summers says, I wish he hadn't said that, because I've worked in government, and that's not true. There's a lot of good people there. And on the one hand, you're saying, well, hold on, we need to hold on to that thought. It's part of the populist sentiment to be angry and to you know, look at people's identity rather than their ideas. On the other hand, if you think Hayek is right, there's something in the system that, you know, maybe we're getting there now. You know, you're talking about Trump, you're talking about different things happening, and we heard about some of the frustrations about what's going on now with a political system that seems to be moving away from ideas of liberal democracy in the sense that you can't understand the laws and you don't know when you're violating them.
Trust me, you're violating them. You should know, you're always violating them.
Exactly. So it is also a libertarian urge to be angry, isn't it?
I disagree. And I'll tell you what, to be occasionally angry at gross and flagrant injustices, yes. But not to be an angry person. This is a psychological matter. I think we should resist this. And I've been spending time trying to not be an angry person. Angry people, their lives suck. It's terrible. They're mean-spirited. They became bitter old people. And I decided a long time, I don't want to be a bitter old person. Old person is okay. I'm fine with that.
But libertarians are saying never trust a politician. The worst get on top.
Let me explain why I think he was misquoted.
Okay.
Hayek's book is about central planning, not about government per se. And so it's been misused over and over and over. It's not a book about the welfare state. It's about centrally planned economy, which is not what Larry Summers was working for. So Summers didn't get it right. It was not about him. Hayek did not say politics always attracts low-life scum. It's not true. He said a centrally planned system will tend to promote the Lysenkos of the world because they have total power to silence their critics. That was his argument. I think it was well established. It's not a critique of the welfare state or social democracy, broadly understood. Denmark have all the problems, and Danish people spend most of their time thinking about the problems. And you're not unusual in that. Everybody does that, right? It's a pretty nice country, right? You can all pat yourselves on the back. You are not monsters. You do not live in the terrible tyranny in the worst place in the world. It's a pretty great country. Naturally, you focus on the things that are failures and that you want to fix, or the trends that are going wrong. Hayek was talking about communism, not about contemporary Denmark or contemporary even the United States. So I think that was taken out of context. The second thing, Hayek did not hate politicians. And this is, I think, a mistake for libertarians to say, I hate politicians. Laws, bad laws do not repeal themselves. Someone has to go into parliament and do it. And we should welcome those people who are good at shaking hands, kissing babies, and making friends. They're good politicians. And we want those people to have liberal values. So they will kiss more babies, shake more hands, go to the factory gates at 7 o'clock in the morning and shake everyone's hands as they're going in and shake them when they're coming home and get their votes for liberal policies. So I totally reject the view that politicians are scum. Okay, many of them are, but I reject the view that they all are. I have known some people in politics who have been people of high personal integrity. To show that, you have to be willing to lose an election. If you're not willing to lose an election, you've lost your soul at some point, and that's a hard thing to do. But I just disagree with this mentality that says politicians are evil, politics always brings out the worst, we should reject it. I don't agree at all. It's also defeatist for the perspective of liberty.
Thanks, Tom. I agree. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to focus on brevity and conciseness. I'm going to refrain from saying my name, but going to add some other interesting information. I was born in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I came to Denmark as a 3-year-old, and I've lived my entire life here, really. Fast forward today, I actually work part-time, and I've become somewhat ambivalent about it. I work for the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland. And I've become quite ambivalent about my part-time work because I consider myself as a conservative with libertarian proclivities, and as the party has evolved into something that's very national conservative, I'd say. And Frauke Petri, she left, right? But I feel that you neglect identifying the frustration of a lot of these people I've met in Germany. They see the erosion of their national identity, their traditions, and their culture as something that's way more important than having extra money in the bank. A lot of the people, they're more willing to have less money, but then at least to be able to preserve their national identity and their culture. And how can you, is this the Achilles heel of libertarianism, that you cannot really cater to this? I mean, the national identity as well as conservatism or national conservatism? I'd like to have an answer from you. Yeah, thank you.
It's a deep nested set of questions about identity, and identitarianism, which is another name for this trend in Europe and the United States, presupposes that some get to define the identity of others. And that is one of the things I find deeply illiberal about it. What does it mean to be a German? That was defined in the past, and Jews were not Germans. People who thought that they were, that they had lived there, who wore the Iron Cross from the First World War, and then they were told that they're enemy aliens internally in the society. So we should be very cautious about trying to define who we are rather than letting people define themselves. as they want to in a more pluralistic mode. That said, initially, I knew some of the people involved in the Alternative für Deutschland. It was an anti-Euro party. And the Euro is an open question. Was it a good thing or a bad thing? Like Brexit to me. You weigh the arguments one side or the other. And there were good arguments against the Euro from the perspective of the interests of Germany and Europe. But at the time I told them, I said, I think this is a mistake. An anti-party would just be anti. What are you for? You don't have any positive program of limited government. You don't stand up for the Rechtsstaat and for all those important principles of the pillar of German freedom and stability after the war. You're just against the Euro. And I said, they'll be against something else. And I'm sorry to say I was right. That it lost its identity and became against all these other things. And they began fishing in very disturbing waters. And when you hear the talk about eine völkische Gemeinschaft, again, this is very disturbing about this. This language has not been heard since 1945. So it's not just we want to live as we want to live. It has overtones that are shocking. And so there's been a trend of the more reasonable people fleeing the party. And they're becoming more and more extreme and Pegida-oriented. So I don't think this is going to end well for Germany. But initially, it had very fine people in it. But I think they started on the wrong foot. Instead of creating an alternative liberal or liberal conservative or centrist conservative party, they created an anti-party. That was, I think, their fundamental mistake. All that said, I do think that the German immigration policy was not handled well. I like and applaud what Mrs. Merkel said, wir schaffen das. We can do it, faced with a very serious humanitarian crisis not very far away. But Germans should be able to schaffen better than that, and to do it in a more consistent and orderly fashion. And then the final point, I think that viewing one's personal identity solely through immersion in a group is psychologically harmful and politically harmful to a society. And it's much better to attempt to seek personal and familial enrichment through success rather than retreating to the success of a nation and identifying with that. The people who do that are what we call in technical sociological terms losers, right? People who cannot create on their own and retreat into a group identity that's merely inherited. So you don't have to accomplish anything. You can just say, I'm white and you're a nigger, or whatever is the equivalent in a different society. It's an unearned identity, and I think that's very frightening trend, and I see it on the edges in Germany, but also in the United States, and it scares me.
Tom, on the identity issue, I think what should we call them, nationalists, national conservatives, would argue back and say, well, you guys only accept the individual. You're claiming that it's unhealthy, I think was the term you used, to only have the collective vision of the nation or whatever. But they would argue back and say, well, you only have the individual, and that is as problematic. What do you say to that?
Oh, I think it's a reasonable response and false. And I think that there is a liberal patriotism, and we can always stipulate how we use one term or another. So let me stipulate nationalism and patriotism as two different ideas. Nationalism is the idea of our nation, and it sets up our nation against other nations. Patriotism means love of your country. And I think that's compatible with liberalism. But you want to have, as Edmund Burke said, your country should be lovable. You should love the good things about your country and not just, we kicked the hell out of the Danes. we took Schleswig-Holstein from them. Right? That's nationalism. Patriotism should be, we have built, and our forefathers and foremothers have built a society that is good, a society that is noble, a society based on proper moral principles, sometimes called civic patriotism or Verfassungspatriotismus, constitutional patriotism. That's what we want to love out about our society. So if you think about Belgium, try to imagine being a Belgian patriot. It's possible. Think about the pioneering advances of the Belgian cities, Antwerp and the other cities, and how they're great centers of commerce and art and the creation of a civil society. There's something to love about that, and to walk down the streets of Antwerp and say, this is my city. I love it here. And this is a city that has produced so much greatness. That's what I think Germans should feel about German society, about the deep roots of civilization there, of urban culture and so on, and not what nationalists tend to focus on, which is military glory and the position of your nation above another. That's a loser's game. Every nation was at one time bigger than it is now, virtually. You know, maybe not Switzerland. But pretty much all the rest. And this is the problem. Think of the Balkans we were talking about here. Everyone can say at one time, our nation ruled all the others. Well, that's true. Everybody can say that. And when you play that game, and you're always worried about the battle of the Blackbird's Field in Serbia and so on, you go through that, it's just a recipe for endless conflict. Polish nationalism, German nationalism, Russian nationalism, and so on. But patriotism is different. And I think there is a liberal patriotism also for deeply rooted European societies.
We'll take two quick questions. We're approaching the time when we have to wrap up, so please be brief.
So they should be in rap.
Exactly.
Ikke kort, men jeg har godt tænkt på et hurtigt.
Ikke kort?
Det er fordi, jeg har en lidt mere kompliceret ting, jeg vil spørge, men det må jeg ikke. Fordi du venter med at give ordet.
Vi tager den herovre.
Lars Christensen. First of all, thank you, Tom, for a positive message, I think, and that's really what my question is about. Since I'm asking the question, I should mention Milton Friedman, which is the rule. Milton died 12 years ago. To me, our movement from then on actually kind of lost sight of itself, the classical liberal movement. It lost sight of itself, so I no longer would call myself a libertarian because it's simply been tainted by anti-immigrant nuts.
What do you call yourself?
Classical liberal or moron. But Tom, how do we find back to, I think, the positive message? Because what I think was the message of Milton Friedman, and less so from Hayek, but particularly from Milton Friedman, was a vision for what Reagan called a shining city on the hill, a society we all would like to live in, which is with open gates, as he said. How do we find back to our movement instead of being taken over by fearful, hateful people, and instead of coming out and say, we want to have our vision of the world is one of growth, optimism, tolerance, enlightenment. How to get back to that, and how do we get all these anti-immigrant nationalist idiots out of our movement?
I think that
Nice positive language there yourself.
Yeah.
I was occasionally angry, as some would say.
Well, I'll tell you, there are some groups I work with that are working very hard on this, and there's one that I hope some people here are involved in, the Students for Liberty. It was founded by students, and a group of them came to me some years ago and said, will you be an advisor? I said, I like that a lot. That's very flattering to me. I did not tell them to organize the group. They did it themselves. They came and asked me for advice. The second part I like is sometimes they don't take my advice. And they say, we thought about it. We decided to do something else, which I really like because they're thinking. They understand how to reach out to young people. I don't socialize with 19-year-olds a lot, so I don't know what they think. And they do. So this is a very, very positive thing. But they have a message that is not angry and hateful. They say, we don't want to fight with the left or the right. We want to make friends for freedom. I love this group. I'm very happy, and I speak to their groups all around the world. I'll see them in Vilnius tomorrow. They have a big chapter there. I'm going to go to the Indonesian Students for Liberty conference, and then the one in Korea, both next week. And they had 950 students in Prague at their big conference. I spoke in the Republic of Georgia in November, and they had almost 1,000 there. And I like their message. It is a positive message that freedom, free markets are about living together cooperatively. Last point, and here I'll be a little provocative, and I'll try to be quick. It's worth more thinking about whether there's even a gendered dimension, to use a term that's used a lot. If you look at law, I don't know about Denmark, but in the US, men who go to law school are much more likely to go into criminal law and prosecution. Very few women do. Some do, but not many. They're the outliers. Women go into corporate law, family law, and so on. These are cooperative forms of law. Let's solve a problem. We have a problem, let's solve them. It's possible that there's, whether it's because of culture or something else, a gender difference. But it may be that the language is important here also. What are rights? Many libertarians have treated rights as, this is mine, stay the hell off. I'll punch you, right? Stay out of my yard, which is what old men say all over the world. Get out of my garden. Rather than seeing rights as the basis for cooperation. Rights are what make it possible for us to cooperate. Without rights, we're going to fight constantly. It's when I know what's yours and what's mine, what the rules are, we can now cooperate. And we have not articulated the idea of rights effectively as the foundation of a cooperative society. It's been articulated in a lot of libertarian discourse as the screw you language. This is mine, get out. When it's portrayed that way, it's appealing, understandably, to lots of people. So I think we need to reformulate our discourse accurately. It's not falsification. The foundation of a cooperative, harmonious society. That was the message of Frederick Bastiat. Bastiat talked about a harmonious society in which interests are reconciled through the rule of law. And I think that's the message we missed. Milton Friedman was very good at portraying it because he always was so kind and had a little twinkle in his eye when he was debating the most extreme socialist. He never said, I hate you, or communicated that. He said, well, let's think about that. And he was just so gentle. And we need more of that, but we need more of Bastiat's idea of the harmonious cooperative society.
Tom, thanks for coming to Copenhagen.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow in Vilnius.